Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Radical Candor Podcast. I'm Kim Scott.
I'm Jason Rosoff.
And I'm Amy Sandler. This past summer, our content intern, Katie Bartlett. Hi, Katie.
Hi, Katie.
We miss you. Katie wrote a piece about the workplace culture trend toward niceness, investigating whether or not prioritizing, quote, nice feedback that's full of vague platitudes over specific and sincere feedback that could make people uncomfortable is, in fact, harmful. Kim, in Radical Candor, you wrote, quote, when bosses are too invested in everyone getting along, they also fail to encourage the people on their team to criticize one another for fear of sowing discord. They create the kind of work environment where being nice is prioritized at the expense of critiquing and therefore improving actual performance, end quote. So, Kim, you call this ruinous empathy. Yeah.
Yes. Somebody recently, sorry to interrupt, but I can't help myself because it's so relevant. Somebody reached out to me and said they called this false harmony. And I think that's a good, I love ruinous empathy. I think false harmony is another good way to describe this.
It's, dare I say, it strikes just the right note.
Yes.
So whether we call it ruinous empathy, false harmony, but what we call it aside, I mean, Kim, when you wrote Radical Candor, and at this point now, how long ago, if we're in 2023, what year did you actually start writing the rough draft, would you say?
I started writing it probably in 2012.
Gosh, so at this point, more than 10 years. I mean,
yeah.
We're going to get into it, but I'm curious, as you look at this quote now, sort of standing on its own, do you feel like we're kind of where we were then, more so, less so? Like anything leap out at you that you would correct for or update on those couple sentences I read?
I think it is unfortunately still true. And I think this is something that we as people will probably always have to manage against. I think that sort of radical candor, it's a journey, not a destination. Like I think it's.
Did you just say journey? That's always been a word that you've not been a fan of.
I hate all of those kinds of cliches.
I love a journey and a path, but yes, I know that's not you.
But I think what I'm trying to say is that it's a little bit like diet and exercise. It's not like we will ever have to stop exercising because we're fit now. You know, it's not like we can eat well for a week and then declare victory and revert to our donuts. Though I know we both love donuts, Amy.
Thank you.
So I think that is still true. And unfortunately, I think, and I don't mean to sound discouraging, but I think it always probably will be true. It's something we'll always have to manage against, just as we have to manage against the temptation to eat too many donuts.
Jason, you were nodding. What do you think about that? Will we ever outcreate our desire? And we'll talk about maybe why we even have that sort of inherent desire.
I suspect we won't. I tend to agree with Kim that there's something innate in us human beings, on average anyway, are sort of harmony-seeking creatures. And there's good reason for that. Like if we can sort of go along to get along, there are a lot of benefits from living closely with other human beings. You know, we can divide labor, we can protect each other. There's like many innate benefits. And I think the essential harm of false harmony is that it calcifies the system. It creates pressure to remain the same, even though when changing something about the system would actually make everybody better off.
Yeah, and I think there's maybe even something more dangerous about it, more insidious, which is that when we're living in this sort of false harmony, and I'm going to call it that instead of ruinous empathy, because I think there's also often a lot of manipulative insincerity in there, and we can talk about that in a minute. But when we're living in this world where we're not confronting the things, if we spend too much time in floating between ruinous empathy and manipulative insincerity, One of the many problems with that is that we're ceding the ground to obnoxious aggression. Because as bad as ruinous empathy, as bad as obnoxious aggression is, this ruinous empathy is even less effective. It's even worse in the long run. It's even less kind in the long run than obnoxious aggression. And so in these moments where very often a culture will start out being radically candid, and then it'll sort of grow because they have some success, and then they fall prey to this gravitational pull of ruinous empathy. And the problem there is, like, think about how you feel when you notice something is wrong, but you don't feel like it's okay to say that something's wrong. Like, that is incredibly stressful. And so, to me, it feels like I want to explode. And then so this is happening on a team, on a culture, and everybody's like kind of increasingly frustrated by not being able to give voice to things, to either their feelings or their thoughts. And then finally somebody says the thing. And maybe they don't say it in the best possible way because they're so frustrated. And this is like a very typical journey to obnoxious aggression. And now everybody kind of is relaxed. Everybody's like, oh, thank God the person said the thing. And so the person does it again. And maybe they do it even more obnoxiously the next time because they kind of got rewarded for that obnoxious aggression because it was at least people were, at least they had said the thing. And people, because the majority of people are still hanging out in this false harmony, they're thinking, oh, she didn't mean any harm. Oh, he's a good guy or whatever. They're giving this person a pass for their obnoxious behavior. And then all of a sudden, because obnoxious aggression works better than ruinous empathy, this person gets promoted. This is the moment on a team, which happens all too often, when the asshole has won. And now the culture begins to lose because everybody else now zooms from ruinous empathy down to manipulative insincerity. And they're talking badly about this person who often now is their new boss. What a jerk. They say maybe even less charitable things than that, but nobody's talking to this person directly. And now you have a really toxic culture where you have this one person acting like a total jerk and everybody else is talking badly about that person behind their back. And the truth, it gets buried in these toxic behaviors. So part of my goal with radical candor is not to cede the ground to obnoxious aggression, but to do something better.
Well, it's so interesting, Kim, because as you were talking, what was coming to mind was so much of what we focus on are these one-on-one relationships, and that, radical candor is measured not at sort of the speaker's mouth, but at the listener's ear. And so what I think of might be radical candor might land as obnoxious aggression for you and ruinous empathy for Jason, et cetera. And so when we kind of extrapolate that out to culture, which is really what you're talking about, is toxic culture. So there was in 2022, MIT Sloan Management Review defined what they called the toxic 5 attributes, which were disrespectful, non-inclusive, unethical, cutthroat, and abusive. Niceness is not on the list. I will say that those words, I would say, tend to fall into behavior that we might construe as obnoxious aggression on an individual basis. And so I think the question that we're looking at today is the other side of care personally, ruinous empathy, manipulative insincerity, the ways in which that can contribute to a toxic culture. And one way that may be helpful for us to think about it is, and I may have mentioned this on the podcast before, but we've been doing these polls recently in workshops where we ask people to, first of all, talk about a mistake they tend to make the most. And by and large, ruinous empathy tends to be the majority there. There's definitely, a good number self-identify obnoxious aggression is the mistake they make, good number manipulative insincerity, but by and large, majority is ruinous empathy. And then not in every culture, but in most cultures, those numbers flip. And the self-identified ruinous empathy, it becomes smaller. And what we tend to see as manipulative insincerity is the response for what is the mistake you experience most at work.
So people say they are
ruinously empathetic, but they're experiencing manipulative insincerity.
Got it.
And we've had some really rich conversations about why this might be the case. And of course, obnoxious aggression still makes a show in there. But especially for companies where we have these sort of, insert company name nice as sort of a culture, we actually see that where, I don't want to hurt their feelings, but the way it's landing for me is everyone's having a meeting and I'm not there.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that often is what happened. Jason, you were going to say something.
There's a subtlety here, which is ruinous empathy it's very hard to ensure. I think the reason why people self-identify as being ruinously empathetic is because they factor in their intent.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why someone might experience that, whatever the behavior is that comes out as a result of that, as manipulatively insincere, is because their intent is not clear. So let's take an example where someone knows that a colleague is struggling with a personal health issue and softballs feedback for them on a particular project. And the reason that they do that, their intent in doing that is like, give the person a break and I'll pick up the slack. But then, and let's say this person is managing the work on that project and is responsible for giving feedback on the quality of the work. But then what happens is a colleague gets annoyed with that person because their work has been slipping, and they say something to that person. They're like, "Hey, your work really hasn't been cutting it." Now, all of a sudden, the person's silence, it's very easy to not understand that the intent was to cut them some slack and give them a break. Now it feels like a betrayal, right? Because they're like, well, you left me out on a limb and now my colleagues are criticizing my work and I was looking to you to tell me whether or not I was on the right track. And I think that this like intent versus impact is at the heart of the of that dichotomy that we see in those results. Is like when people evaluate their own actions, they evaluate them based on their intent. And when they evaluate other people's actions, they evaluate them based on the impact that they had.
Is that the fundamental attribution error?
Yes.
Is that the right definition of that or no?
I think so.
Okay.
I think also there's, it is easier. I mean, part of the reason why I called it when I started the book back in 2000 and whenever it was,
those many years ago.
I actually, for a long time, I was calling it cruel empathy, not ruinous empathy, because the impact is cruel.
Yeah.
And part of the reason why I changed it was that it was so hard for people to self-identify as cruelly empathetic, because they didn't mean to be cruel. And often, so I think part of it is, part of the intent thing is that it's easier to point out other people's manipulative insincerity than to recognize our own manipulative insincerity, because manipulative is such a harsh word. And nobody wants to think, I mean, I've not met anyone anyway who wants to think of themselves as a master manipulator. That's not what most people aspire to. And yet all of us have a desire to be liked. I certainly don't like feeling unliked. And at the end, what's happening often in manipulative insincerity is that I'm worried about my own likability. I'm worried about my own reputation. And that's like normal and natural, and we can't eliminate that. But I think if we want to move, we've got to recognize it if we're not going to give ourselves over to that.
It's so interesting that backstory on the naming, because when I do talk about manipulative insincerity and noting that we all behave this way, and we'll often talk about why do we do this, and for many reasons, again, human nature, we want to feel belonging. So there can often be a sense of belonging. I'm belonging by complaining about this other person, and now we have sort of a spirit of belonging through complaining. But also, like, there was an article in Harvard Business Review called "The Hazards of a Nice Company Culture," and they identified, and this was written by Timothy R. Clark, but they identified 4 of the top reasons why, and one of them was to avoid conflict and gain approval. And then it says, as a reflection of their own desire to be liked, leaders often avoid conflict and stigmatize dissent. They would rather be nice than offend. misbelieving that those are the only two choices.
Yes. And I think another thing people do, not just leaders, although leaders maybe do it more than the rest of us, is they use that sort of quote unquote nice culture as a way to repress dissent. And so if somebody disagrees with them, they're not being nice, you know, and so that that can have a silencing effect.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think another thing that often happens is that people, part of the reason why people are reluctant to be radically candid is that they fear that they feel they fear reprisal. You know, they feel like they'll be punished, and often they, in fact, are punished for saying what they really think. At the very least, they're tone policed. And so that also has a silencing effect, which is bad for individuals and it's bad for the culture. And ultimately, it's bad for the leader because the leader doesn't know what's really happening.
A few minutes ago, as we were going through that list of what, the attributes of a toxic culture, I identified non-inclusive as the attribute to which toxic positivity contributes.
Yes.
This is similar in some ways to your aversion to values, which is if you demand that someone is nice all the time, if you say niceness is a value that we have and you're expected to be nice, if a person can't figure out a way to nicely tell you that you've been racist or to nicely tell you that now they've violated in doing what is best for you and what is best for the company, which is to identify a behavior that is going to get in the way of their comfort and ability to do their job and the long-term success of the organization, they have violated a norm. And so they're between a rock and a hard place. And it's a lot easier to be mad at someone for violating a norm than it is to be mad at yourself for doing something that is racist or something that is harming the performance of the company, for taking responsibility for an action that's having a negative impact on somebody else.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think another example of this happened when you were here visiting, Jason, and we were talking to my child who was working with someone who was helping a group of people kind of resolve a conflict. And it was clear that the mediator had a particular point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And so when one child said, I think, and proceeded to say what the mediator agreed with, the person said, oh, yeah, that's a really good point,
I hear you.
Yeah, they said that's a good point. And then when other people voiced a different point of view than the mediator kind of brushed them off. And then the mediator summarized at the end. So what I hear you all saying, and then heard one person, but not the other people. And that was infuriating. I mean, I forgot what Mars said, but it was funny. She was like, shut up, bitch. Or something.
I house of radical candor.
It really is. I was impressed by their analysis. Like I thought they did such a good job of pointing out the specific moments when this mediator made it very clear to the people in that room that they had a particular point of view.
Yeah.
And they didn't care to hear what other people had to say. And I think it could have come from a positive intention, which was to like minimize the amount of conflict, but it did not help to resolve any conflict.
No. And
in fact, it served to further
false harmony. It was pretending that we all agree when they did not all agree. Like that is infuriating. Like that silences people, makes them not feel heard. And it would be better just not to have the conversation. Like don't pretend to listen if you're not going to listen.
Yep.
It's interesting because from this Hazards of a Nice Company Culture from HBR, I did want to quote In many of these cultures, leaders have simply spread a thin layer of politeness over a thick layer of fear. There's the appearance of harmony and alignment, but in reality, there's often dysfunction simmering beneath the surface that results in a lack of honest communication, intellectual bravery, innovation, and accountability. End quote. And when I heard the story about the mediator, Kim, what was coming up was like, we all have this need and this desire to feel heard and understood. It doesn't mean that we have to agree, but at least feeling like everyone's voice is included. And I think one of the things about this, they had another quote, a hologram that falsely signals inclusion, collaboration, and high performance. So it's
Yes.
almost worse to pretend that you're having this inclusive mediation, but not really, some voices are still more valuable than other voices.
Yes, totally agree. I mean, I almost want to ask you to read that again. It was so well said. I love it.
So the full quote was, what's touted as niceness is often nothing more than the veneer of civility, a cute nod to psychological safety, a hologram that falsely signals inclusion, collaboration, and high performance. In many of these cultures, leaders have simply spread a thin layer of politeness over a thick layer of fear. The appearance of harmony and alignment.
Just underline that. Underline.
Yeah.
That's the sentence.
That's
good.
The sentence. Yeah. And so I think, the flip side of this, we're talking about this false harmony. And would it be safe to say, do you think, Kim, Jason, that maybe false harmony embraces both sides of the sort of low challenge? So both ruinous empathy and manipulative insincerity could sort of both be part of false harmony?
100%. 100%. Because pretending to agree when you disagree and then remaining silent because you don't want to hurt someone, that's the ruinous empathy, false harmony. Pretending to agree when you disagree because you're worried about your own reputation and then you go back behind this person's back and talk badly about them, that's the manipulative insincerity part of the false harmony. And also I want to acknowledge that sometimes I myself, and I think I'm not alone in this, have wound up in manipulative insincerity, not so much because I'm worried about my own reputation, but because I'm afraid for good reason. I'm afraid that I'll be punished for saying what I really think. And so there can be sort of a self-protective manipulative insincerity that is totally understandable. And this is something I've been sort of struggling with. Like, I don't want to tell people to go be radically candid if it's going to get them fired. Like, I want to acknowledge that can happen. I sort of feel like I need to write another book called Build Solidarity, Speak Truth to Power, like making it safe to be radically candid when it doesn't feel safe. And maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but probably if you feel like it's not safe, you got to pay attention to that feeling.
Well, I'm always excited to hear about your ideas and all the book ideas. I will say it was kind of interesting, Kim, that you kind of gave folks in the ruinous empathy quadrant a little bit of a gift with calling it ruinous empathy. The manipulative insincerity, I think it's interesting because those words do speak to something that, I'll often say, like, it can be fun to tell stories when we've acted like a jerk. And we all like to say how we didn't want to hurt their feelings, but it doesn't feel as good to identify with manipulative insincerity. And I wonder if there's another phrase for that version of the low care, low challenge quadrant, which is that self-protection and that.
Maybe it's self-protective insincerity,
Yeah.
Maybe that's what it is.
Yeah. So the other thing I want to bring into this conversation, just looking at this idea of, quote, toxic positivity, I was doing some proverbial air quotes there. There was a quote from clinical psychologist Dr. Jamie Zuckerman, who said, toxic positivity at its core is an avoidance strategy used to push away and invalidate any internal discomfort. And I think what's so interesting about that is when we think about, in order to practice radical candor, you actually have to be willing to, manage the other person's discomfort, but also our own discomfort. And so I think that's interesting. Jason, what's your own definition of how you think about toxic positivity? Does that definition land for you, or do you experience it in another way?
As opposed to defining toxic positivity, I think what that definition is trying to do is define why, the sort of, not the proximal, but the core motivator, the real reason why people behave in a toxically positive way, which is they're trying to avoid their own discomfort, and feeling discomfort themselves. And so by portraying a positive perspective on everything, expecting everybody else to do the same, theoretically, they're protecting themselves from having to deal with the discomfort of knowing that things aren't as they think they are, that someone else might be having a different experience, and that person's perspective may be valid, and in fact might be more valid than their own sort of potentially distorted view, positive view of how things are going. I think this is a really common thing that comes up in software when it comes to schedules. So I think of all of the times that I've been in conversation with somebody where they're clearly putting a positive spin on it. And they say, well, we didn't hit these 3 milestones, but we're still on track for delivering the project on time and on budget. And so my question is, well, was your original estimate for the project accurate to the best of your ability? And they say, yes, of course, it was accurate. And is your new estimate also accurate? Meaning you didn't hit those milestones. And they say, yes, we didn't hit the milestones, but you're still going to meet the overall project timeline. Yes. Okay, so all those three things cannot be true at the same time. So the question, and I think the hard part is, so the product manager is responsible to the organization to make sure that a project is completed high quality, on time, and on budget, right? Like that's what the product manager is responsible for. And this particular version of toxic positivity has the side effect of stressing everybody else who works on that project out of their minds. Like, because they feel like they now have an impossible task, which is it's been promised that they're somehow going to magically make up time that they don't have and not spend any additional money or resources in order to accomplish the same goal. And they know it's impossible. And so there have been many sort of conversations which boil down to, well, those things can't all be true at the same time. And so something's got to give, and we're better off recognizing that now than later. And I've had that conversation 150 times in my career.
Yeah. No, that's why I started laughing when you it's optimism is a good thing, I think, but toxic positivity is not. And figuring out when you've crossed the line between optimism and encouraging people and toxic positivity. I mean, one of the things that we've talked about is my experience as a bank teller. I was a terrible bank teller. and I think I closed the books properly only 3 times in the summer that I was a bank teller, because I don't know, I can't do math in my head. And my boss at this bank, and by the way, the errors always went in one direction, because when I gave away the bank's money, people were less apt to point out the error than when I cheated them, understandably. And so I was giving away a lot of the bank's money this summer, and my boss kept encouraging me that you can do this. And then she sort of crossed over into what I would call toxic positivity, where she said, if you just try, I know you're smart, you're not failing because you're stupid, because you go to this school, but so I know you can do it if you just care enough. So now all of a sudden, not only is it a practical failing, it's a moral failing,
Mm-hmm.
And I feel terrible about myself. It would have been much kinder for her to have said to me, or if I had been more than 18 years old and had the strength to say this, it would have been better if I could have said this is not a job that I'm cut out for. I'm harming the bank by continuing to do this job. I shouldn't do this job anymore. I should, either I should get another job at the bank, or I should go mow lawns or something for the summer. And yet that's not what happened. I continued to, and I was so unhappy. That's but with the toxic positivity was way worse than being fired would have been, actually.
Yeah.
It is such an interesting question. Like, how do you know when you're providing encouragement to someone? Like, Kim, there's like a path forward to you being a bank teller, right? Like, sort of looking at the reality as a lead. Like, how does a leader discern something that is, encouragement and motivation versus sort of like, okay, it's time to cut our losses?
This is something that when I was working and teaching at Apple, Richard Tedlow, who Amy, I think you and I both studied under Richard Tedlow in business school. He would ask me this all the time when I was talking about a leader's job is to encourage people. And he's like, make sure that people are not like that asshole trainer at the gym who pushes me beyond my level of endurance and puts my health at risk. And I always think, so I have like Richard Tedlow's voice in my head about toxic positivity, because he's like, really, people who push people too hard push them beyond their levels of endurance. And that's dangerous. Actually, it can be physically dangerous.
Yeah. I was also thinking about how toxic positivity is the land of euphemisms. Like, it's the absence of specificity. So like the conversation, I'm thinking of scheduled conversations where you're saying, well, if we just try really hard, I think we can get this done.
Yeah.
Well, what the hell does try really hard mean?
Yeah.
Do you mean if we all stay here till 10 o'clock every night for the next 6 weeks and we don't take lunch breaks? And you know what I'm saying?
We
like,
get
if you
bladder infections because we don't go to the bathroom.
Right. If you got really specific about what trying hard looks like, it could potentially be motivating. Maybe people would be, maybe it's exciting and people would be like, yes, I'm willing to, dedicate my nights for the next 6 weeks to this project in order to get it done. But I think when it's lacks specificity is when it's toxic, because then you're not taking responsibility as the person who's encouraging others. You're not taking responsibility for the consequences. Well, I didn't tell them to stay till 10 o'clock every night.
Yeah,
they just chose to do that. I said we had to try harder, and they chose to stay till 10 o'clock every night.
Yes.
Well, it's interesting about the specificity. I mean, looking at the article, and some of this was more around emotions and mental health, and especially with the pandemic, they describe toxic positivity can take many forms. It can be a family member who chastises you for expressing frustration instead of listening to why you're upset. Comments like, look on the bright side, be grateful. A meme that tells you to just change your outlook to be happy. And what they share is it can be your own feelings that you shouldn't dwell on your feelings of sadness, anxiety, loneliness, or fear. And I think what's interesting is that so much of radical candor is about a willingness to see clearly, to see reality for what it is, that there is suffering, that this person is experiencing suffering, that if it were so easy to just say, look on the bright side, that, folks would do it rather than acknowledging that for some people that might be hard. And so I'm just curious, Kim, as you think about what Jason was bringing about the importance of being specific and just those broad brushes of just change your mind, where do you come down on any other ideas of how the radical candor framework can actually help people to distinguish between toxic positivity and being supportive?
Yeah, I think the word you said that was really important is clarity. Like, the more you can be clear, the less likely you are to cross over into toxic positivity. And I have two examples of toxic positivity that are springing to my mind. One is something that I did last week, actually, Amy. We were talking about what we wanted to say, if anything, in response to the terrorist attacks. And I dropped in a poem that was like, it was beautiful and it was painting a picture of the future, but it was totally failing to address the emotions that people were having at the time. So I think that was, and you very kindly pointed it out, and I was like, oh, absolutely right, and I don't think I ever said that to you. So thank you for the feedback. And I think it was an example. And I'm very prone, actually, to toxic positivity. I think that's that. Well, we can talk more about that. Maybe I should just reserve that for my next conversation with my therapist. But anyway, I am prone to it. I would say another example of toxic positivity that really had its roots in lack of clarity. Comes from a CEO I knew who had to fire someone, and he had to fire someone he really cared about, and he really was thinking a lot about how to say this in the kindest possible way. And maybe he overthought. So he went in and he had this long conversation with the person, reassuring them how wonderful he thought they were and blah, 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 blah. So the conversation was over and the person left his office. And then 3 hours later, the person came back, opened the door and said, "Did you fire me back there?" Or not? And he clutched his head and he was like, "Oh, I was dreading doing it. And now I had to do it again," which was bad for me and much worse for this other person who had just spent the last 3 hours wondering, did I just get fired or did I not get fired? Like, that's a terrible, terrible place to be. So I think that people can deal with change, even sort of change that they're unhappy about, but leaving them uncertain as to what the situation is cruel. Actually, unintentionally cruel, perhaps, but cruel.
I so appreciate that story. And, something that I was thinking, and from what you said earlier, Kim, around how there's almost the benefit of obnoxious aggression, knowing where the person stands, and you're not saying that it's like second best, but I'm wondering if our sort of favorite radical candor mistakes are also, just in the same way radical candor is measured at the listener's ear, if the favorite mistakes are also individual. So as somebody who, the mistake I think I tend to make the most is ruinous empathy, though when I'm under stress, it can be obnoxious aggression. But I would still rather have somebody be ruinously empathetic than obnoxiously aggressive. That is just, I think, my personal preference. And so I'm really curious. Like, I'd sort of still rather not know.
Oh my God. I would so much rather have the obnoxious aggression. so much rather have it.
I wonder, like, how universal that. I mean, Jason, I'm curious. Like, if you had to pick on the menu, which one would you prefer?
I think I want to agree with you, Amy, but unfortunately, life has taught me that it almost always turns out worse for me and the other person in the end.
That is also, life has actually taught me that as well. But I still think
I think here's the reason why I think it's a more interesting question, which is I see a lot of problems in the world. Like, I walk around and I see everything that is wrong. So in my head all the time is like, this is wrong and that's wrong and that's wrong and all this shit is wrong. And so I don't, and it's taken me so I used to give voice to all those things. So I used to say what I observed, and not in a way that was intended to be obnoxious. But I would get stuff in my review like, it would be helpful if you would, instead of saying what is wrong, make a suggestion for how to fix it. So then I tried to implement that. I tried to make suggestions for how to fix things. And it was like, you should let other people do their own jobs and not and then worry more about yourself. So like, I've learned, and it's not that these things are in an absolute sense unimportant, but they're not important for me to sort of remark on. It's not critical for me to do it. And because of that, I don't really need people. Like, it's very rarely the case that I am shocked by somebody's observation when they share it with me. Still, it happens, and that's why I'm grateful for it. And what I've realized is that it's often really important for other people to tell you what they think is wrong. But that's an important part about being in a functional relationship with another human being, is that they can tell you what they think is wrong. Even if you already know it, even if you're already working on it, it's important that they be able to tell that to you, and for you to be able to respond with compassion, whether that's just listening in the moment or agreeing to work on it with them or whatever it is, whatever the response is that they're looking for. But that's a hard one lesson. Well, so I think if you have if your negativity bias is turned up to 11, like mine is, I think there's a temptation from time to time to want to live in ruinous empathy. Like, you don't need to tell me a problem because I'm already thinking about that problem.
It's so funny as you say that, because what I was realizing.
Also, maybe a conversation for my therapist.
Yeah, we've got a lot of follow-ups after this one. We'll circle back. one of my top values, if not my top value, is harmony.
Yeah.
And so harmony will be more important for me than almost anything else, even if that means not everything is said, et cetera. But Jason, you also said something very interesting, which was about in important relationships. In my most important relationships, I would much rather have the sort of ouch of obnoxious aggression than wondering what's happened, right? I'd rather have it come off in a way that maybe there was like a short-term damage. I think in a workplace where there's a lot of relationships that sort of can come and go, I'd almost rather like not know and sort of be a little more blissfully ignorant. Brandy is shaking her head vociferously. But again, I think because when I think about what I value most is harmony. And so I think when you think about, and Kim, you value efficiency and clarity. I don't know if that's like your top, but I wonder what's underneath it. And Brandy, why you're shaking your head so vociferously.
Yeah, I want to hear
more
from Brandy, but I will say part of the reason why I prefer obnoxious aggression is that I think that you get to harmony faster that way than you do. I think that there are a few things more ruinous for harmony than ruinous empathy.
Yeah.
Yes. And Amy, I'm shaking my head because I guess it depends on what the thing is. Is it a minor thing? Like Amy refuses to use an M dash, which is a thing that Amy and I have where anytime she sends me something, I have to replace all the dashes with M dashes. Or
what's an M dash?
An M dash is a long dash versus like a hyphen.
Oh, yeah.
Kim, you're a hyphenator, not an M dash.
And it really, as somebody who was like trained in copywriting, it really hurts my eyes. So I have to fix it. But there was a time when
You also don't use a serial comma. Which hurts my eyes.
Well, sometimes we do, but I was trained in AP style and they don't use serial commas. When I was at the newspaper, I got thrown into the deep end with no training of paginating using InDesign, and I didn't know how to resize the photos. So unbeknownst to me, the designer who would finalize the paper was redoing my photos every time. And then when I got promoted to a bigger paper, she's like, hey, let me show you something. And I was mortified that for like 6 months, I had been creating all this extra work for her. So I was so glad she told me, and I wish she had told me on day one. I don't want people to think I'm incompetent or I'm doing something to make their life harder. Also that can be a path to getting fired if someone doesn't tell you you're doing something wrong.
No, none of them are good. I'm just thinking of like the emotional journey. For me, it takes a lot more to process and rebound from obnoxious aggression than I think I'm still figuring it out. I have some more figuring out to do. None of them are good.
I mean, I prefer radical candor, which is what she gave me. But if she had yelled at me and said, Brandy, you're making all this extra work for me, I still would have preferred that to like what had happened was for 6 months, she was redoing all my images because I didn't understand about the sizing tool.
I think also it's like part of my preference is comes around what makes me feel safe and what makes me feel unsafe. And ruinous empathy makes me feel really, really unsafe.
Me too.
And like, I can't trust the people around me. I can't rely on them. And it causes me way more negative emotions than obnoxious aggression. Like we can get past it. Ruinous empathy, when people don't tell me, or like when they tell me 6 months later, it's really hard for me emotionally.
That framing of safe and unsafe.
It takes up a lot of space in your head trying to figure out what's going on, what's really happening, what's not being said, and then you feel like a crazy person.
Yeah.
It's rare in a relationship to say it was a positive experience that I was always wondering what they were thinking. Like, I think that's a thing.
Well, that's why I was saying, like, in a relation, like, I think that's what I was saying about scale. Like, I think in my closer relationships, I would rather they make the mistake of obnoxious aggression.
Yes. Yeah. I totally understand what you're saying.
The impact of obnoxious aggression takes a lot of work for me to unpack, in the same way that I think the lack of potential safety that Kim feels in Ruinous Empathy takes a lot of
energy
work for her to unpack. So I think maybe what I'm saying is it's not about preferred. It's just like the amount of work to recover from those actions is maybe a better way to put it.
Yeah. I think also we're sort of talking sort of intellectually / rationally, but this is an emotional, like what is worse for you emotionally? It sounds like it's obnoxious aggression, and none of us should try to talk you out of that, because if that's what it is emotionally, that's what it is,
Thanks, Kim. I feel seen and heard.
I'm late to the game, but I'm finally reading The Body Keeps the Score. And I think part of I have some emotionally, my response to obnoxious aggression is often, for whatever reason, affection. Like I find it amusing. So I think because my father had kind of a reputation for being a jerk, and I know he was not a jerk. He was he was the most loving of fathers, but he could be obnoxiously aggressive sometimes. And it was his way of actually showing affection. And so sometimes maybe I'm giving the obnoxious aggression too easy a pass, but sometimes I feel like, I mean, in fact, my husband said something when I started writing Radical Respect / Just Work. He said, just promise me that you're not going to say it's not okay for men to give each other shit, because that's often how we get along with each other.
Yeah.
And I thought that was like an important point, actually.
It's such an important point. And I think like we bring our history and our, like, of course, like if that's something that actually feels familiar and you like it resonates with you. And so I think my experience of it is like just being someone that is so sensitive and does value harmony so much. And as we know from my, third grade report cards, that I cry at criticism, like obnoxious, like that lands in such, as someone who is so empathetic, like that lands in such a difficult way for me. So I'm not saying let's go all out there and be ruinously empathetic. Like, no, I teach this because I believe in radical candor. I think I really like, Kim, how you said about the safety and maybe there's almost like a familiarity around that. And Jason, you were saying something that I interrupted.
Two things. One of the most popular shows in the United States right now, due to its appearance on streaming services, is a show called Suits, which is about attorneys. And the two main characters, Harvey Specter and Michael Ross, have obnoxious aggression. It is the way that they show affection to each other. They challenge each other constantly without really showing any sort of care. But what you realize in the sort of more sort of tender moments of the show is like that ribbing is how they're like sort of keeping each other sharp. And as a lawyer, like part of the work is to like be decisive. And it's very clear that it's far worse and far less safe if the person, and it happens in the show several times, that the person screws up and the other person doesn't say anything, has no reaction to it. That is like a huge betrayal, because they feel like, if you really cared about me, you would have said something, even if it was going to come across wrong. So if anybody wants to see an example of a way in which, outside in obnoxious aggression, meaning like as a casual observer might appear like obnoxious aggression, that relationship is a really good example of that.
Yeah, so for the two of them, it is radical candor. And for most of us watching, it is obnoxious aggression.
Correct. There are plenty of moments where you're like, I cannot believe that, that they just said that to each other. But you sort of, it's so well acted, because there's like, it's not overdone, but there'll be like a smirk at the end of that exchange. And that it landed in a way that felt like love.
Yeah. And my father always smirked, actually. Yeah. He always, and sometimes people misinterpreted his smirk, but what he was trying to communicate with his smirk, not always successfully, is I'm saying this because I respect you,
right,
and I care about you,
Yeah.
I love hearing that and learning about your dad, Kim.
My last thing before we move on. This whole episode, that like the thing that's been rattling around in the back of my head is, I think we're having this conversation because the word positivity is positive. And we add the word toxic because we're trying to describe what we think is a unique phenomenon. But I think if we called it required positivity or
Yes.
Forced positivity. It is clearly toxic in the same way that forced greediness and forced angriness, and you know what I'm saying? Like all of those things, if you're like, you must be angry all the time in order to be effective at this job, you would be like, that's ridiculous and it's going to lead to terrible things. But like, you must be happy all the time. You must be positive all the time. Like that's clearly toxic. I think the idea of compulsion.
Jason, when you were talking, so one of the pieces of guidance that we will share is, to not say, don't take it personally, right? Because the person's going to have the experience. I actually do believe that it is very helpful when we do not take things personally. Like that is actually a way in which I try to move through the world, which is to realize like I am having a response to something and I'm going to look at why I'm having this response to something. But me telling someone to not take it personally is very different than me having that as an attitude. Similarly, knowing, what I know about brain science and about, rewiring and reframing, trying to have a positive mindset, I think is inherently a helpful thing. But me forcing someone to have a positive mindset is the same exact thing of negating that other person's experience. So I just love that you brought that in, that it's less about the positivity and about the forced or compulsory nature of it.
Yep. The experience that I have had of toxic positivity is that I internalize like that something is wrong with me. If I am not having a great time, that it's me, that it's my fault that I'm not having a great time.
Yes. I feel like so many parties I went to in college were examples of toxic positivity. I mean, my roommates and I would say, let's go so we can come home, you know?
You were like a 45-year-old person in college, it sounds like.
I was. The introvert's guide to college partying. Let's go so we can come home.
I think now it's time for our tips.
I think it sure is.
Yes, let's do it.
Now it's time for our Radical Candor Checklist tips you can use to start putting radical candor into practice.
Tip number 1, if your desire to be nice is getting in the way of telling someone something they'd be better off knowing, flip the script and put yourself in that person's shoes. Doing what makes you feel good in the moment, if it harms the other person in the long run, isn't nice or kind. And remember, caring personally, it's about caring personally for the other person, not for your own feelings.
Can I add to that? Can I say it's caring personally about yourself and the other person? Like we can't not care about ourselves.
I'm so tempted to say no, but
we have to put Kim, you have to put your, like, if you didn't feel good enough to show up for today's podcast, we need you to speak up for yourself.
Yes, you're right. You do have to care personally about yourself, but especially when you're the leader, I think the relationship is a lonely one-way street. You have got to care about your people without necessarily demanding that they care about you back in the same way. I do think there's something in it's like being a parent, you know?
Yeah, I think as a leader, you're really, your primary orientation is, is this helping?
Yeah, but you do have to you are at the center of your circle. So yes, you're correct. Even though it was the imp of the perverse in me, Amy, that wanted to say no. Yes, you're right.
I love the imp. Tip number 2, you are not a cruise director, a game show host, or a cheerleader, much as we might like one of those roles or all of them. But when your intention to be nice has the impact of making other folks feel hurt or betrayed, you're perpetuating false harmony. Harmony is such a wonderful ideal, but it's so important to focus not only on your intention, but the impact it has on other people. And if those two things aren't aligning, then your niceness is harmful.
And not so nice after all.
Not so nice after all.
Tip number 3, if you're the leader, if you're the boss, it's important to make it safe for everyone on your team to speak truth to power. Enforcing a culture of niceness also perpetuates a culture of silence, where people will be fearful to tell you things you need to know and instead tell you what they think you want to hear, hurting you and them in the long run.
Can we throw in, Jason, make sure that you are not simply spreading a thin layer of politeness over a thick layer of fear?
I think that's the
that should be tip number 4.
Yeah.
Amy,
tip number
take it away.
I think I just said it, but I'll say it again. As a leader, look at your actions and make sure that you are not spreading a thin layer of politeness over a thick layer of fear. Kim, do you have a specific example of what that might look like? A thin layer of politeness over a thick layer of fear.
I do. And I don't want to talk about it publicly. It is the reason why I reacted so strongly is that I'm in a situation right now where exactly that thing is happening. And in the spirit of praise in public, criticize in private, I'm not going to tell the story because it's too close. I can't even anonymize it.
So that we want to acknowledge the author. Again, that was Timothy R. Clark in The Hazards of a Nice Company Culture. For more tips, you can go to radicalcandor.com/resources to download our free learning guides, sign up for Radical Candor on Masterclass, get our lit video book, register for our workplace comedy series, The Feedback Loop, so much more. Show notes are at radicalcandor.com/podcast. Kim just mentioned it. But let's praise in public and private, and of course, criticize in private. So if you like what you hear, go ahead, rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. If you've got criticism, send it our way at podcast@radicalcandor.com. Bye for now.
Take care, everybody.
The Radical Candor podcast is based on the book Radical Candor, Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity by Kim Scott. Episodes are written and produced by Brandy Neal with script editing by me, Amy Sandler. The show features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff and is hosted by me, still Amy Sandler. Nick Carissimi is our audio engineer. The Radical Candor podcast theme music was composed by Cliff Goldmacher. Follow us on LinkedIn, Radical Candor the Company, and visit us at radicalcandor.com.